I've never done this podcast style of interview before, so the sound quality is pretty shonky. I don't have a studio, and this was done kind of on the fly, so afraid the thumping around you can hear is us simply moving in our chairs. Also, this was recorded on the 24th of February, the first day of the Russian offensive. Things are obviously in a huge state of flux in this conflict, and changing minute by minute. But I will say that the Ukrainian military and people are fiercely defending themselves from this aggression. I, for one, hope that the political leadership of the world does everything they can to make the Russians stop this invasion and pull back. And most of all, I want to salute the Ukrainian military for their courage in defending their country, sympathise with the Ukrainian people for the unwarranted suffering that has been inflicted upon them, and also express my admiration for the many Russians who have been out protesting this war made by their own government. With all that said, let's begin. Okay, I'm going to be doing a bit of a different one from what I normally do this time. This is going to be more like a podcast because considering events in Ukraine and the Russian invasion, I actually have the opportunity to talk to Professor Alaric Searle of the University of Salford. If you're a regular viewer, you'll know that myself and Professor Searle co-authored a book recently, I think it came out this year, on Syrian Democratic Forces armoured units. Professor Searle is an internationally renowned expert in the history of armoured warfare, has been a visiting professor at a Chinese university,
Nankai University,
and has been a visiting fellow at Oxford. So he seems like a uniquely qualified authority to discuss the situation in Ukraine, certainly from a armoured warfare perspective.
Well, good to see you again, Ed. Just a small correction. A book came out last year, not this year.
Was it last year? I have so many books I can't remember. But yeah, so obviously Ukraine, it's a tragedy.
Yeah, it's more than just a tragedy. It really is an earthquake in international relations. I would put it in context as more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, essentially Khrushchev was gambling. But Khrushchev did listen to his advisors up to a point. Kennedy listened to his advisors. Some generals were telling him just obliterate Cuba. But a former ambassador in Moscow said, well, hold on. Khrushchev has painted himself into a corner. You have to give him a way out. The difference now is that Putin has not painted himself into a corner. He's just going all out.
Yeah, he's where he wants to be.
Yeah. And he's planned this, obviously, for a long, long time.
Well, I mean, we can get into like the nitty-gritty of the campaign, I suppose, or what little was known about it later. But that's sort of an interesting question, isn't it, about like what is Putin's motivation? And I think I know. I'd be interested to know what you think.
Well, I would say that his rather bizarre, meandering statement before he sent the troops in give an indication that what he's really after is he wants greater Russia.
Yeah.
In a way, he wants to re-establish the Soviet Union, but without the Soviet part. But he really wants greater Russia. His appearance with Macron with a giant table, I mean, that would be hilariously funny and reminds you a bit of Sacha Baron Cohen's The Dictator, but it's not funny because it's serious.
Yeah.
He produced, or a book was produced for him by, I think, ghostwriters. Probably Alexander Dugin had something to do with it, one of his advisors. It's a book called Project Russia, and it's basically Putin's Mein Kampf.
Yeah.
And he outlines in it he wants greater Russia, extending probably even into the Scandinavian countries, into the heart of Europe. So the idea he just simply wants Ukraine, I think, is very optimistic.
Yeah. I must admit, I think as well, part of his motivation is personal security in some ways, because I think, as I say, his rambling speech on historical speech, I watched all that, and the subtitles and was, just bizarre. But I think he has learned one lesson from history, and he's learned the lesson of what is the biggest threat to any dictator? And it's their own people. They normally end up against the wall getting shot. And I do think, you see it expounded a bit nowadays, but I do think he recognised that the big threat to him personally was a democratic Ukraine.
Yeah.
And a prosperous Ukraine. Because that way, you then get to the point where you have Russian-speaking people who are regularly interacting with one another, and the Russians in Moscow will eventually go, what do we need this guy for? And his kleptocratic mates when they're over there doing perfectly well. And I do wonder if that's part of his calculation.
I mean, I would suspect that the demonstrations in Belarus really put the wind up him.
Yeah.
Because if you have Ukraine affecting or infecting Belarus and then it goes over to Russia, that's a serious problem.
Because there was some Kyrgyzstan as well, wasn't there? Was that Kyrgyzstan a little while ago? Russian troops went in. There was a protest.
Yeah, I mean,
it's blown up. It's the same sort of thing. You know, you have a strong man in charge, which is exactly his pattern. And it's a threat. It's a threat to him to have the neighbours become democratic. So,
I mean, the thing is, there's an interesting question about Putin's sort of state of mind. So I wouldn't call him mad.
No.
At one level, he's incredibly calculating and clever.
Yeah.
If you look at his behaviour in Syria, I would say he played a weak hand brilliantly.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
He really got what he wanted. He secured the base at Latakia.
Mm-hmm.
He propped up Assad's regime.
Yeah.
He made Assad to some extent dependent upon him. He sucked the West in.
Yeah.
He just waited for Trump to stumble, which he did,
mm-hmm.
which he probably was able to predict. Trump would do something stupid like abandoning the Kurds. The thing is, I think his agenda is probably not the same agenda as the general staff, the Russian general staff.
Yeah.
I think he's probably able to convince them by going back to Stalin's idea of there needs to be some series of buffer states between Russia and Western Europe, which is something they will immediately associate with.
Yeah.
But I think that's really not his particular game. He wants this extensive empire. Again, given his age, I would suspect there's a desperation to create some kind of legacy.
Tsar 2.0. Yeah. I mean, that's something I said earlier. I think I put a tweet out. But one of his big things was, NATO expansion is the threat. The thing is, how many NATO countries bordered Russia? Norway, Turkey, I suppose Poland with Kaliningrad. I think that's it, isn't it? I don't think there's any other... Or there weren't none others.
Finland's
not NATO.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So, he's now basically annexed Belarus. Let's not pretend otherwise.
Yeah.
So now he actually has Poland, like a border with Poland. If he takes Ukraine, he will have more borders with Poland. If it then moves into Moldova, which it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest, that's the next stepstone in my opinion. Then it's Romania as well. So instead of having NATO expansion as a threat, he's actively moving his borders up to the threat. So that's just a nonsense, quite frankly. Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is that, again, when we talk about the threat, NATO is clearly not a military threat because of the state of many of the armed forces in NATO. I mean, it's not capable of doing really very much at all.
In a lot of ways, NATO is a victim of its own success, or perceived success.
Or political success.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen the consequence of that, of the drawdowns across that. I mean, you obviously, I forgot to mention, you used to teach at the Bundeswehr, didn't you? You were at the Bundeswehr Academy.
I taught English at one of the Bundeswehr universities, the one in Munich.
So, I mean, you're better connected with like the state of the German defence ministries now. But we've seen it in the British defence. It's been this big drawback from armoured warfare and conventional warfare with a greater focus on things like cyber, which we were talking about earlier. Is great until, what are you going to do when the tanks come and throw your mouse at them?
Yeah.
I mean, cyber warfare has a role, but it isn't the be-all and end-all,
I mean, again, there's been people in the West have fallen into the trap of saying, the M1 tank is better than the latest Russian tank. Yeah. But if you've got thousands of an okay tank...
Yeah, and they've got three.
And you've got then armed forces which are not very well trained, not very well equipped. You can essentially swamp them. Yeah.
I think, certainly NATO, like the expansion with the Polish army, I know they've been buying, they now have Leopard 2s and they're buying M1s. I think they were under no illusions about the need to be prepared because they are the front line effectively. Whereas everyone else is just sort of palmed off responsibility, or that's what it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Germany, less so France, probably Holland and Belgium have just fallen into a state of self-delusion. about security. Everything's fine. The threat's China. It's not Russia. And now we've ended up in a situation which many Western generals have been predicting for a long time.
Yeah.
General Sir Richard Sheriff published a book in 2016 warning about the rise of Russia.
Yeah. And probably got cast down for it, basically.
Studiously ignored, basically.
Yeah. I mean, and this is the thing, like, going back to the thing of NATO expansion, we're now going to be seeing, I'm already seeing the Finnish PM put out a tweet saying we're now actively thinking that we need to be in NATO because they're under no illusions. The Finns certainly remember. The Swedes are in the same boat. They're talking about NATO. I said earlier about Moldova. I think that's the next Western policymakers need to be making plain now what their stance on Moldova is, because they have a breakaway Russian-supported state, Transnistria. If Ukraine falls, I think I'm being charitable if I say if. It's probably more like when, let's be honest.
Yeah.
Moldova's going to be the next one, I think. And, what we just let that go? Is that going to be the policy? Or are they going to try and head off another disaster in the making now by making it plain it won't stand? But we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I think this raises an interesting question, which is how long will it take the Russian army to subdue the Ukrainians? Yeah. How bloody will it be? What will end up on TV screens? Will the effect be to galvanise people in Europe, or will they feel intimidated and say, well, let's just forget other countries because we don't want a war and it'll be terrible, and look at the energy prices are going through the roof. Yeah. So it is an interesting question how long it's going to take them. Some of the early pictures were a little bit reminiscent of sort of shock and awe in 2003. Yeah. So bombs raining down. The question is, Ukraine's a pretty large country, and can you subdue it very, very quickly? Can you subdue it, say, in 3 weeks? Yeah. I suspect that's a bit optimistic.
Probably, yeah. I mean, the thing is, and this is definitely your field, but Ukraine's perfect tank country. Yeah. It's just, I know people have been saying, oh, make it Afghanistan. It's not Afghanistan. It's not. It'd be much more difficult to fight have a resistance movement in the plains when you're facing drones and thermals. The cities, yes, but fighting in the cities that's a catastrophe is waiting to happen.
I mean, if you're going to fight in the cities, which I agree is probably the best place where they can cause maximum casualties to the Russians, but you're going to end up with your cities in ruins.
Yeah, that's it. And let's face facts, like, for all the castigation the Americans got with things like Mosul or what they did in Iraq, and a lot of it was justified, like the abuse they get for it is justified because there was a lot of damage. It's nothing compared to what the Russians are quite capable of doing. And I speak from personal experience on that, having seen Russian airstrikes in Syria. And I can't imagine it be any different in Ukraine, which is they level things. When you get resistance, they smash it. There's
Grozny.
Yeah.
Just think of Grozny. Yeah. What happened to that?
Yeah. And again, it took the Russians, was it 3 or 4 wars to suppress Chechnya, but they didn't stop and they wiped out the opposition. That's what you do. Now, it's effective, but is the rest of the world willing to stand by and watch it happen? And at the moment, probably. But
I mean, we'll have to see. It'll be interesting to watch the reactions of certain other countries. So Turkey, Hungary, China. What are these countries going to say about it, or will they just keep quiet?
Yeah. This is the big question. I mean, I haven't seen about the sanctions. I know that's the big threat, but
well, I think Putin's been basically insulating himself against sanctions for a long time.
Yeah, probably.
It's not as if he didn't consider this. Yeah, this has been considered, and he's perfectly willing to accept sanctions. Yeah,
I mean, that would actually make sense because, as you said, he's already threatened nuclear weapons in the event of a military intervention against him. So he's basically daring people to oppose him militarily. Yeah, with the ultimate thing. Now, you can't dismiss that. So if he's then neutralised any military option, which is effectively what he's done, that only leaves... You have to assume he planned that. So he's planned for sanctions as the only option, which means he's probably secured himself. Yeah.
And I would reckon as well that the reason why Biden and NATO said they would not set foot in Ukrainian territory was fear of Putin using nuclear weapons. Yeah. Because one thing which America has still got is a functioning intelligence service. Yes. Through satellites, all kinds of other means. So I would reckon that they knew exactly what he was going to come up with.
Yeah, that would make sense. I mean, I say we now have to wait and see how how long the Ukrainians hold out, if they can rally, and then what comes next.
Yeah, I mean, if we just stay on the campaign for a moment, because I think that's interesting. So what struck me looking at the map of Ukraine with the forces positioned to the north and then to the east, it just was horribly reminiscent of the map of Poland in 1939.
Yeah.
Where you're faced with essentially an enemy on three sides. I mean, Poland had the added insult of the Russians coming in halfway through from the east. But if you've got forces in the north and forces to west or the east, then how do you form a continuous front line?
You can't, yeah.
Your capital is very, very close to the Belarusian border, so very difficult to defend. And again, the terrain is not exactly a problem for armoured forces. It's perfect for them. So how do you do this campaign for the Ukrainians? So the only thing I can think of is if you try and find some kind of defensive point in the interior of the country and wait till the Russians outrun the supply lines. But again, if you don't have an air force, if you don't have air superiority, it's going to be very, very difficult. So, again, place your bets. Will it be a 6-week campaign or will it be a 3-week campaign? Very hard to know. I would suspect that the actual course of the campaign will be quite significant. If the Russians sustain fairly serious casualties in armoured vehicles, I don't think they care about soldiers, honestly. They never have done. If they sustain, I don't know, say 20 to 30% losses in armoured vehicles, which, given the size of the territory, what they're trying to do, would not be an unreasonable assumption if the Ukrainians do fight and have worked out a defensive plan. That could play a part in what the next move is. So they might say, well, let's just, at the moment, forget about the Baltic states. Let's forget about Moldova. So I think the actual end result of the campaign will be significant for what's going to happen in the immediate future.
Yeah. I mean, I think looking at what the West has done, I think there's almost been unofficial policies to try to make it as bloody for the Russians as possible. And that's why we saw the supply of like NLAWs from Britain and javelins from a whole bunch of people. These are defensive weapons, really static. Well, you're not lugging them around that far. Ideal for city fighting, but you're not stopping, say, Third Shock Army with them. Not unless you've got thousands of them, and they didn't. They didn't have that many. I saw an interesting thing the other day about actually in terms of the tank quality. The Belarusian tanks are all like old T-64s. They're older than me. Like, there've been some updates, but they're ancient and they're not up to it. They're firing old ammunition. So I think Ukrainian armoured forces, by the look of it, are going to be badly overmatched. I mean, they would be by numbers anyway, but they would be in quality as well. So it really does leave their manoeuvre, as I say, without air superiority, their manoeuvre warfare is limited in options. It just leaves defensive battles, and that means in the streets,
I'm not sure how many sort of defensive positions they've got. I mean,
I don't know. Yeah.
The trenches in eastern Ukraine look pretty primitive.
Yeah.
I mean, you're looking at sort of Syrian civil war type of defense positions. In fact, not as good as there. Yeah.
And with the thermobaric weapons the Russians love so much and are very spectacular, that's just death. You're just going to die.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, it's pretty grim stuff we're talking about. I mean, it does raise a question about the West culpability in essentially just throwing the Ukrainians under a bus.
Yeah, especially and this is what annoys me, is I think this could have been headed off. Like, it should have been headed off years ago. The signs were kind of, as you say, he's published his Mein Kampf.
Yeah.
If they paid it, people say we shouldn't be drawing too many parallels with Hitler. But there are a lot of parallels with Hitler, I mean, he announced his intentions and it got ignored. So, with a couple of years ago, if it had been laid out, that it had been made plain, that the sort of consequences, and there had been a united position, but there wasn't.
And if we return to the, or stay with the parallels with Hitler, I mean, he certainly does have a kind of vision of an ethno-nationalist state where the Russians are superior to everyone else. And certainly the Ukrainians are looked down on by Russians. I mean, I shared a flat briefly in Germany with someone from eastern Ukraine who was quite open in his detestation of Ukrainians, regarded them as inferior, said we hate them. There is an ethnic division between Russians and Ukrainians, and that is not good news if you're Ukrainian.
Yeah.
Of course, the question is, if he does occupy the whole of the country, what next? So is he going to try and introduce some sort of secret police system? Are there going to be lots of prisons, concentration camps being created? What happens if you have passive resistance? How does he envision the future of the Ukrainian state, or Ukraine as a province of Greater Russia?
Yeah, well, I mean,
how's the economic system going to function? Are they going to be somehow integrated into the Russian economic system? How would that work? There's lots of questions here where, again, we know that people that love military campaigns and pulling them off often don't think beyond the end of it.
Yeah.
As we saw with the US and Britain in Iraq in 2003. So it's very easy to destroy a weaker set of armed forces. But what comes next?
Yeah, I mean, he's done this in like parts of Georgia and say in the Caucasus. But those are much smaller areas.
Yeah.
With much smaller populations. So yeah, what's the population of Ukraine? Like 40 million or something?
I think it's 44 million.
Yeah, that's a lot of people.
And it's a huge territory as well.
Yeah.
How do you want to police that? So do you want to have troops everywhere trying to occupy it? Again, that's going to be a drain on resources. So, might it be a better strategy for Ukraine to just give up and then try passive resistance? Try and hide some of the anti-tank weapons? If they had studied Iraq, maybe they might have come up with an idea. Make it just so costly for the Russians that it turns into the second Afghanistan.
I did see one thing today, which was the president, Zelensky? Is his name?
Zelensky.
Yeah, he announced like any citizen who can take up arms, come and collect one.
Well, people have just been buying weapons privately.
I guess so, yeah. But I mean, the government would just hand them out to, go fight the Russians. I mean, there's a great way to get lots of dead people, but it does put a lot of guns in the ground for later use, doesn't it? So, I don't know. And that you're right. I mean, I think their losses will be less. I think they've been planning this for at least a year. They're provisioned. They're stocked up. They're ready to go. This was textbook. If you want to launch an armoured campaign, a combined arms campaign, getting a year to prepare for it, perfect. Yeah. So I think they'll overrun sooner rather than later. I think their losses are going to be heavy, but I think not as bad as we think.
Yeah. I mean, 190,000 troops is the highest number I've heard from the American side, which seems realistic. But, of course, they can bring in reserves. It's not going to be that it will stay at 190,000.
Yeah, and those will be the occupation troops, as you said, yeah. I know they brought in like the special police units as well, and those are like the Chechnya brigades. So they are specialists in counterinsurgency in Russian style. I think it's going to be a case of they'll integrate back into Greater Russia. How that pans out in 50 years' time, we'll see. But
I mean, that would again presumably mean sending Russians to settle in bits of Ukraine.
Possibly.
Because then it makes it harder for the country to come back again.
And that's it. I mean, the population of Russia's like 200 odd million, 214 million, I think. So you're adding 44 hostile. It's a substantial proportion of your population who don't like you. Obviously, there's going to be refugees as well, like fleeing Ukraine. That's going to be another disaster.
Yeah.
So Romania and Poland have to prepare themselves for that. Hopefully they are.
I mean, if we rewind to the Cold War and think about the Western policy of having governments in exile, I wonder whether Zelensky might be spirited out at some point and set up a government in exile, which would then be a real thorn in the Russians' flesh if constant news broadcasts, propaganda were going out.
Well, the thing about that is, from what little I've seen of the Russian advance, it does look almost like they're trying to do like a northern, a right swing around Kiev to cut it off from Poland and Romania. So cut the country off. They've seized the airport. They've seen the main airport in Kiev. So that might be the point. They might want to be trying to grab the Ukrainian government. So that isn't an option. Again, we'll see how that works out. But
I mean, you could still manage to escape, I think. I mean, you can do a right swing round, Kiev, but at the same time, you can't sort of cover all the ground.
Yeah.
So it might be you could smuggle him out. And in terms of the end game, that would be quite a significant point, I think.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, we'll have to wait and see. Yeah. But in terms of like, what do you think? So let's pan forward. Okay, we'll assume Ukraine falls. What next? Now, I know you think he may be like Putin might eye up things like the Baltic states, other NATO property. I think that'd be a very dangerous move. I mean, NATO is a defensive treaty. The whole point of an attack on NATO is an attack on all countries in NATO.
I think at that point, so he'll probably have to try and digest Ukraine first.
Yeah.
There'll be all kinds of protestations about Russia has no aggressive intentions anywhere else, which is what we heard a week ago.
Yeah.
About we're not going to invade. I don't think anybody in the Baltic states will be buying it.
One of them, I can't remember, I think it's the Lithuanians, they've actually mobilised. And they moved their army up to the border because they're not happy.
I mean, I suspect what he might do. I mean, about 2 weeks ago, I thought he's going to go in and just bite off a third of Ukraine and just sit there.
Yeah, like the Donetsk and Luhansk. Yeah.
Yeah, or territory south of the Belarusian border would have been a target, and then just try and chew away bit by bit, in the same way as Hitler conquered Czechoslovakia. Took out the border areas where all the defensive positions were, and then just swallowed the rest a year later. What I think might happen with the Baltic states is if Russian forces just move in, say, 50 kilometres into Estonia and stop, what does NATO do then? Particularly if there's a barrage of threats about it's a protective shield to prevent an attack on Ukraine, all the usual Russian rhetoric. What does NATO then do? Do they try and eject them when there's a hail of threats about nuclear weapons?
I don't know. I mean, when do you call the bluff and hope it's a bluff? Yeah, especially at that stage. I don't know. I mean, I think NATO would have to, otherwise there's no point to NATO.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, just because they should doesn't mean they would. I assume they would. But,
I mean, he could bite off a bit of Estonia, then he could bite a little bit into Poland, and again just try and test Western resolve. And I think where he might try and test Western resolve is a sort of slow grinding campaign against the West.
Yeah.
And that's where the hybrid warfare becomes significant, where there'll be a series of cyber attacks. Watch how the Western economy is going to a downward spiral. Wait for the first protests. Try and sow division. Try and persuade people that this is all a waste of time. Ukraine's a faraway country. We don't care. So I think this will be an extended war, and I think Britain certainly has to try and restructure itself to deal with what's coming now.
Yeah. So how do you see that restructuring taking place? Is it in the security services and then reforming the military?
Well, that might be part of it. I think just people's expectations of a consumer society have got to go because we've already got spiralling fuel costs. The cost of living is going through the roof. I think people are going to have to wake up that the standard of living that we had maybe the last 20, 30 years is not sustainable, particularly in the middle of a global conflict between democracy and totalitarianism. So we're going to have to think less of a consumer society and more of a sort of Britain as it was in the Second World War. Reorganising things, things need to be more community-based rather than individualism out of control. I think there's going to be an awful lot of questions which are going to have to be raised, and we're going to have to come up with answers very, very quickly.
Yeah, no, that seems fair enough. Obviously, the current system it's basically failed. And I think we need to figure out where to patch it up to get it working again. So it wouldn't surprise me if the changes like that do have to take place. Yeah,
I suppose one issue is to what extent, if we think about invasions in past military history. So, for example, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. So that was a lightning campaign.
Yeah.
What made it very unpopular was the drip of casualties over the following year. So obviously the West seems quite fragile, but it does seem to, in a crisis, actually sort of wake up out of its hibernation and get its act together. It might be that if there is some kind of drip of casualties of the Russian army, that the population in Russia start to get a bit uneasy about it all. So again, counter-propaganda to Putin will be extremely important.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things the whole thing about, and I'm still seeing it now. People pushing this is because of NATO expansion. This is Russia response to that. I think don't get me wrong, I do think there are genuine Russian concerns about NATO expansion. I don't think they're anything new, and I don't think there's anything that worried about. If they were worried about it, they would have worried about it more in, I don't know, the late 90s, which they complain about. But for it to suddenly become a justification, a casus belli against Ukraine, which I should point out, Russia signed several agreements guaranteeing the sovereignty and territory of Ukraine, and has just thrown them out the window. I forgot my point.
Well, I think the issue was that that there is a Russian security worry. Yeah. If we go back to the old way of the Russian General Staff and Stalin thinking we need buffer states between us and the West because we've been invaded so many times, Putin himself knows the West isn't going to invade. Yeah. And it's not about military invasion. It's about invasion of ideas, democratic ideas. So the old conception of Russian security is being used as a way of trying to protect the country and insulate it from democratic ideas, and people objecting to the sort of kleptocracy and the mafia style system that Putin's installed. Yeah.
I mean, so even if NATO does look too fearsome to take on, I mean, I do think Putin has breaking up NATO as a key goal, but that there is plenty of other former Soviet territories out there which don't have protection and are further away. I mean, the Stans, as they are, their prime territory. That might actually put him in conflict with China.
I think that's why he's moving west rather than east.
Right. Yeah.
Because there would be a serious scope for conflict with China.
Yeah.
But I think the stands are not really, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and so on, are not really a serious problem. They're in the sort of economic orbit of Russia.
They play ball, yeah.
So, although there have been some sort of moves to a degree of independence or balancing act by some of the presidents. However, it will be interesting to see how China reacts. Will they send troops to the border, maybe, or more troops to the border? Because they might get a little bit jittery as well.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe. I mean, you know China and the security situation in China far better than I can't imagine they're that frightened by Putin. I think they know that if it comes to a fight between them and the Russians, they're not going to pull any punches, are they? Let's face facts. The Chinese army is still perfectly capable of holding its own, and is actually more capable now than it has been in years. So
certainly one to watch and see how China reacts. But I think at the moment there's an uneasy friendship between the two countries.
Yeah.
But that uneasy friendship can disintegrate very, very quickly, as we've seen it.
So could that be an opportunity, actually, like maybe the West, it's time to seriously consider patching up our issues with China, although those are similar to some of our issues with Russia.
I mean, I think it might be an opportunity here. It's going to be quite difficult for a politician to come in and say, right, let's be friendly with China as a counterweight to Russia.
There's not going to be a Nixon moment.
Probably not. But again, it might. Again, it's difficult to see. I would imagine that things are going to have to get a lot worse before that ends up in the political agenda.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Well, thanks, Ed. That was good to meet up again and talk through these issues.
Yeah, thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Let's hope we don't have to do another one of these when he invades somewhere else then. Quite frankly, it's entirely possible.
Yeah, willing to chew the fat with you over that if it does happen.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much, Alaric.
Yeah, cheers, Ed.
Okay. Hope everyone enjoyed that, and we'll be back to normal videos soon, I suppose.